Hi, this is Justin Colletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I'm on the Plugin Alliance channel, and we have a big treat today. We get to talk to the brain behind Brainworx, Mr. Dirk Ulrich, founder and CEO of Plugin Alliance and Brainworx. Dirk, how are you doing today?
Hi, Justin. Thank you for having me on my own channel, I guess.
Yeah, a rare appearance of you on your own channel. Great to have you here. Dirk is joining us from Pompano Beach down in Florida, just outside of Miami, where he is in the Power Station Studios, sitting in front of a lovely AMEK 9098i console. For those of you who aren't familiar, Plugin Alliance has actually taken ownership of the AMEK brand, and this one has a special place in Dirk's heart because the AMEK channel strips that were based on this console were some of his own personal favorite strips that he used throughout his career when he was producing records and working on rock records and all sorts of stuff. And I want to get a sense for what makes this console different, what makes it special, what makes it interesting. It's being released now in plugin form as the BX console AMEK 9099, and it has new features in it that aren't in the original console, as well as new features that aren't in any other BX console plugins, in addition to being a faithful recreation of the channel strips that are in here. So, Dirk, excited to talk about and find out about what makes this console tick and what makes it special to you.
So when I started as a producer many years ago in Germany, I actually had a budget to buy exactly one really high-end channel strip that I would use to record vocals and guitars, and maybe if I record drums, then I would use it on snare. And I tested and checked a lot of different options, and I actually decided, because it had the notch filters and the high pass and low pass filters, and I really liked the preamp also. So for many years, the sound of this thing here is basically what I've been using for most of my recordings, and that's when we started, obviously, with the Neve console that we have in our studio in Germany, and then with our partners in SSL to model several BX console plugins, I always told our team, basically, hey guys, at some point I really want to model this console too, and now the time is actually here.
Right. And since you've used this for many, many years, or at least channel strips from this type of console for many years, can you give us a sense for where its tone lies compared to other major console lines that people might be familiar with?
Mm-hmm. So it's not as transformer heavy and distorted in a good way, of course, as maybe some of the vintage Neve designs, but the console and the channel strip was designed by Rupert Neve, so it has that Neve tone. And to me, what made me decide for it even was the flexibility. So it has a full-blown 4-band parametric EQ, which you can switch some of the bands to notch filters even. It has the shelving with the sheen and glow, and it has high-pass and low-pass filters in every channel that are flexible also, so you can dial in the frequencies, basically, which was always super important to me when I recorded, for example, distorted guitars. I love rolling off the treble in rock and roll guitars, and when I record vocals, I like to definitely cut the low end, especially when you're recording female voices, to not only to get rid of the rumble, like a lot of preamps have a 60 or 80 hertz filter, but this one goes way higher, and you can actually shape the tone and get that timbre out of a voice by going higher with the filters, and these filters do that beautifully.
Mm. And it's pretty uncommon, I think, on a lot of console plugins to find a notch filter that allows you to do really deep, sharp, precise cuts. Is there anywhere where you found those to be useful in your work?
Yes, for example, if you're EQing cymbals sometimes and you have a really nasty ringing tone, or acoustic guitars, sometimes depending on the room also that you recorded them, you would almost filter out the room imperfections. It's not something you use on every channel all the time, definitely, these notch filters. But when you need them, it's really great that you have them. And to me, I mean, we'll talk about the plugin later, because we even added some features on top of what the console already offers. But this is, I mean, if it's not the most versatile console on the planet, then it's one of the top 2 or 3. So it has so many features and routings and different options.
Yeah, like you said, there's a few things that this original console has that others don't, like that notch filter, the glow and sheen shaping for the EQ. But there are things that are in the plugin version of this that aren't on the original console. So I think a couple of those are worth talking about. One of them is in the dynamic section. You guys, if I understand correctly, the engineers at Brainworx designed a gate specifically for this plugin to add on a gate, if I remember correctly, reminiscent maybe of some of the classic Drummer noise gates. What are some of the things that we're going to find in this plugin that you wouldn't find in the original console?
While we love the tone of the EQ and the compression, the gate is probably not the strongest part of that original console, so we actually decided to go beyond basically what this console offers. And yes, we created a dedicated gate that is just very flexible. And I'm looking at it right now. One thing that sticks out is it does have a second set of high-pass and low-pass filters. So that console actually has two sets of those. In other consoles, you can basically route the high-pass, low-pass filters into the dynamic section. Here you have a dedicated high-pass and low-pass filter just for the gate. And so let's say you want to gate a snare, you can basically zoom in on the tone basically of that snare to try and get less triggering from bass drums and other toms and other signals from the bleeding basically of your microphone. And so that's pretty handy.
That was one of the things that I noticed about this console, particularly the plug-in version of it, is just how flexible the dynamic section can be because of the sidechain capabilities. You can take that main 4-band parametric EQ and put it pre or post dynamics, but you can also make it shape the EQ for your compressor. So using as a really flexible 4-channel EQ for your sidechain. There's a separate shelving filter that you can apply to the sidechain or the main signal. And like you said, yet another separate set of filters that you could apply just to the gate, which is really handy. Another interesting thing in the dynamic section that you guys improved on slightly is it has a button I've never seen before in any type of console. It's called ambience. And this ambience button, if I remember correctly, it allows you to listen to the summed difference of your pre-compression and post-compression signal. So you can almost hear in detail exactly what the compressor is doing. Could you explain a little bit about what that feature is intended to do and how people have used it? Because I think that's something that makes this dynamic section really unique compared to others out there.
Yeah, so the hardware had that feature, and I guess the idea was to actually make people realize and hear what you're actually compressing and doing. My understanding is that a lot of people that used the hardware started using this button almost as an effects sound, because it will play some sounds that are obviously in your signal, but they're buried more or less when you hear the full mix. And so pressing that ambient sound can be a really nice thing that you would blend in maybe with your drums, for example, or maybe even with acoustic guitars again, and piano. I mean, sounds pretty great on piano too. So it's a creative thing. I think the original intent was not to do that, but maybe that's like a lot of tools in audio that have been created to do one thing, and then people figured out that they would do something completely different with them, and so that's what they became famous for even.
Oh, absolutely. It's a familiar story. All right, and just one more thing about the dynamic section. There's so much going on in this console strip. Another first for you guys is that the dynamic section has not only a compressor that could be set really fast and go high ratio so you can use it like a limiter, it has a separate dedicated limiter. So you can have a compressor and a limiter running in series on this. And I believe this limiter has a function that's not there in any of the other BX console strip functions. It has a kind of soft clip feature. Can you tell us a little bit about this and why it might be interesting or useful?
This plugin has a compressor and a limiter, and in the hardware, that's actually the same, but they ran it in parallel, and those two sections had to share a makeup gain also. Here in the plugin, we actually run them in series, as you said. So, and then we have a dedicated makeup knob for each of the sections. And that limiter is actually really, really punchy. It's probably my favorite limiter on drums and on snares and drum bass. So I use that plugin sometimes also on a bass. Maybe I'm not EQing heavily then or doing a lot of stuff, but that limiter is definitely something to be heard on drums. And when we modeled this, our team found that there's a circuit that would actually be relatively easy be converted into a clipping tool also. And obviously, if you limit something, go faster and faster, basically cutting off all the transients, that sounds brutal in a way, and it does introduce distortion. So it's not for the faint of heart and for the audiophiles maybe working on a classical album. But clipping is a big topic these days. There's dedicated clipping plugins, and people use it in mastering even to try and squeeze the last quarter of a dB out of an EDM mix because they feel they have to. there's a clip button now, and then some knobs will disappear, and now you have a full-blown clipper basically in this thing. And that's definitely a creative tool to try out, maybe on drums and screw up some guitars even more. And so yeah, I mean, just try it out and play with it. It has a mix knob too, so it's really cool to add some grit to some signals that maybe could use a little dirt.
Impressive. Yeah, really one of the most fully featured console strip plugins you guys have ever made. One other thing that's in here is you've added on some stereo shaping capabilities that aren't there in any of the other BX console plugins yet. Can you tell us about those features that are added onto this one for the first time?
I mean, first of all, this is another TMT plugin, which is our patented solution to recreate analog as authentically as possible. And that's especially true for stereo channels, because the tolerances in components that give you all these all the realism basically in the signal is especially true for stereo channels. And so we added the mono maker and the stereo width control that you find in quite a few Brainworx mastering and EQ plugins. And we thought, okay, this console is already so feature rich, and we found some space to put it in basically GUI wise. So we decided to go for it. This is definitely the most extensive modeling and plugin design that we've ever done for channel strip. I mean, there's so much in this thing.
Yeah. And to my understanding, the modeling process was a little bit different because although it does have the original console an analog compressor in it, it's a digitally controlled analog compressor. So that's very different to model than anything you guys have done before, right?
Yes. So as you can see, the console itself on the desk has EQ and aux sends and faders and stuff like this, but no dynamics. But then you have select buttons here, and basically you have a screen over there, and so they call it virtual dynamics, but this is a computer that controls a real analog compressor and gate. And first, when I was using this, even I thought, well, that's probably a VCA solution, but it's not. It's actually a discrete analog circuit, but very unique. And I've never heard about anything like this. I'm not sure if it's the only thing that does it, but the only one that I know of. It has a dedicated AD and DA conversion chip, basically, so from analog to digital and back in each channel. And then the sidechain processing is actually done with DSP, which is very unique and very sophisticated in a way for an analog piece of gear. And so obviously, when we model analog gear, I mean, the way that the Brainworx team in Germany does that is, of course, by measuring and circuits, if we have access to them with our partners in this case. And so in this case, this was more like a black box or gray box, because if you have a DSP chip that does something, then you basically have to use different methods. And so it was quite challenging to model this thing. We spent a lot of time on this actually with the team. And then also, we still wanted to make sure that we have the TMT approach, of course. So while the EQ is analog and we can again apply realistic tolerances for all these components that make up this EQ, we needed to be more creative here for the dynamic section, but we did. So even the virtual dynamics have slight tolerances in attack and release times, which in the hardware could also be caused by even just clocking and jitter and all kinds of stuff. So it's very realistic still to the original deck.
Right. And we've mentioned TMT and tolerances a couple times here. For those few out there who are not yet in the know, can you give us the idea for what TMT is, this tolerance modeling technology, and why it's special?
Maybe I should take the chance while we're here on this call, and I know a lot of people will watch this video, to even say something about the myths of TMT that I see online all the time in Facebook groups and on Instagram when people talk about it. So the TMT means tolerance modeling technology, and it's a patent that I came up with a couple of years ago, and I've worked on it with two of our main engineers at that time at Brainworx. They're also part and listed in the patent, of course. The idea is that if you model one channel strip and you listen to the plugin versus the hardware, it sounds perfect. I mean, and we knew even back then when we modeled my Neve console in Germany that we were able to model an EQ and a compressor, But then I was sitting just like here. I had my computer on my Neve console in this case, and I was doing a test mix once we had the plugin done. And I was using like 60 or 70 channels on a pretty complex rock mix with some acoustic elements too. And that mix just didn't sound like the real desk, because I was able to do the very same mix on the real desk and on the laptop, sitting in the same spot with the same speakers, same room, same everything. And it just didn't have that dimension and width and depth. And a lot of people have talked about, of course, how, and they blame digital basically for it. Like, digital never sounds as good and as wide as analog. And us being analog fans, but digital minds, of course, ultimately, we started investigating, and then I came up with this idea, well, in an analog desk, I even know that I'm always using my channel 21 for vocals, and I'm always using channel 7 for snare, because I like the step of that compressor better. And when I EQ a stereo pair of channels for doubled guitars or for synthesizers, I try to match them by ear, but then when we measured what I'd actually EQ'd, it was almost all over the place. I mean, of course, not plus minus 10 dB and tens of thousands of kilohertz apart from each other, but the curves, when you stack them, they didn't completely match. And so this is when we started thinking about why that is, and we introduced the realistic tolerances that components in analog gear basically have. And so if you're familiar with analog design, there's even parts that are rated 1% tolerances, some are rated 2% tolerances, 10 or even up to 20%. And then the less tolerances in analog these components have, the more expensive they usually are. So analog companies, when they, for example, when they say mastering grade, that typically means that they're using mostly 1% and 2% tolerance parts to try and get as closely as possible to make two channels match, basically. And while they're aiming for this in analog, they will never completely get it perfect. And the funny thing is, for the human ear, it seems to be that perfect, which digitally you can achieve that really easy. I mean, you take any digital plugin and you cue 24 channels with the same frequencies, it will be exactly on the same spot, of course. It seems that that's not really what the analog, what the human ear wants to hear. So we figured that in our Neve console, for example, we figured that there's 150 components that contribute to the sound. And so we came up with this TMT and basically introduced these tolerances into that circuit. And we ignored the ones that would maybe control the brightness of LEDs or even the timing of mute buttons and stuff like this. I mean, that's something that doesn't really change the tone of the console too much. Now, some of the myths that I see online is people ask us all the time, why don't you make a plugin that's only the TMT so I can apply it to any other plugin? And that's just not how it works. You have to use the circuit even to hear and to feel the TMT, because if I set a plugin like this to everything zeroed out, basically, then the influence of TMT is almost zero. Of course, maybe you're using at least the high-pass and low-pass filters, and there's some noise generated in these console plugins which you can switch off if you don't like it, but in default setup, that's what it does. So there's already going to be small variances, but you couldn't just have a magic TMT plugin that you put on every channel and then you're using a BX Digital or Fab Filter Digital EQ or something like this, and it would introduce tolerances, because after all, the TMT allows you to have a linked stereo compressor where the attack and release times are still slightly different on both channels, for the left and right, for example. And that's something you could try and mimic by using two mono channels and then maybe dialing in slightly different attack and release settings. But then that goes into everything. I mean, including even like I said, the noise and the center frequencies and everything in that circuit. So
Right, to a degree, it's a bit interactive, so you will only hear a little bit of tolerance variation if everything within the strip is on bypass, but as soon as you start engaging the EQ, boosting the EQ, engaging the compressor, doing some compression, you get increasing buildup of tolerance differences the more parts of the plugin you'd use, and you couldn't really make it interactive like that, I'd imagine, after the fact with some plugin.
A few years ago, I did a presentation at a MixCon event in New York, and we were in a studio where we had beautiful speakers, and I showed that when I EQ'd some cymbals, a stereo set of cymbals, overheads basically, that if I use the EQ and boost really to, let's say, 10 or 12 dB in the high frequencies, which is of course not what you usually do on cymbals, but then you could even hear in the room the phasing that occurred from just these two channels being slightly different from the tolerances. Then when I dialed it back to, let's say, 3 dB of boost or 1 dB, then the effect is still there, but it's natural then. And that's literally what's happening when you're EQing two channels. You're trying with two hands to move the knobs the same amount, or even trying to do it by ear and making sure that everything sounds great. When you actually run some test tones through these channels later and see on a display what you've actually EQ'd, it's not very close usually. It's even your ears and the room. I mean, it could be all kinds of reasons for that, but you will not match two EQ curves completely perfectly.
Yeah, interesting, understood. And in the world of analog modeling, this is absolutely a feature, not a bug. It's what gives these things character and personality. It's probably part of the reason that so many people speak of the BX console line as being some of the most realistic sounding plugins they've ever used. Now, people will be able to try this for free, I believe, if they are Mega subscription bundles users. I guess if you don't even have the Mega subscription bundle, you could try this for free by going to plugin-alliance.com, downloading a 2-week free trial on this. And if you have the Mega bundle, you've got another console strip at your fingertips. And it's also going to be for sale as a one-off plugin as well. Who do you think is the ideal user for this? Who would be most interested in this AMEK over some of the other BX console options out there?
Most of our users actually love the idea that they can now mix and match within one song. For example, they can have the drums run through an SSL console and then the vocals through the Focusrite and maybe the piano and some other things through this. Or they will produce different songs with different consoles and commit to one, just like in the real world where you go into one studio like this and you're mixing on an AMEK and then you're going to another studio. I personally think that this is not the very first console plugin maybe that you should try, just because it's so complex and it may overwhelm you if you've never worked on a real console. We hear people sometimes say, oh, I don't like console plugins because I'm going to build a complex chain for every single channel. When you really dive into the options that a big console like this gives you, and you're starting to use the compressor and the gates and the EQ and the different orders and blend stuff, and I mean, you would be surprised how much stuff you would get done just on the console. And so to me, the ideal user, or who is this for? I'd say the experienced mixer who wants to get that special flavor and who wants to put one plugin. I mean, in most DAWs, there's a shortcut where you can put just the same plugin on 40 channels with one click, and then you're basically sitting in front of a desk, and then you start moving knobs, and the mix will come together pretty fast. And then personally, that's how I mix to this day. And I'm using other plugins for special things, like I want that special compressor on the drum bass, or I want some chorus or some delay and reverb. Then, of course, I'm going to add a few other plugins. But I usually start with putting a console plugin, whether that's the AMEK or an SSL or Focusrite, on any channel and start mixing away.
Yeah, I've heard of more and more mixers doing that, where they just start with a BX console plugin on the entire session, get most of their heavy lifting done there, and then are just grabbing other plugins when they need special effects, some extra type of flavor that isn't in there. And it sounds like the character of this one is going to be somewhere in between the Neve flavor and the SSL flavor that you guys have modeled so well already. So for those of you who are indecisive and feel like the Neve is too Nevey and the SSL is too SSL-y, you've got a somewhat in-between option. So wonderful. Definitely try this out over at plugin-alliance.com, where you can try this out for 2 weeks. Totally for free, or go and get the Mega subscription bundle, probably one of the biggest steals in the world of pro audio, where this will be just another one of the plugins in your arsenal now. Dirk, any last thoughts or ideas for you, and anywhere where people should follow you and catch up with what's going on in your world lately?
First of all, thank you for doing this interview. It was nice seeing you again. I mean, I run into you once in a while, of course, when we have trade shows, and right now we don't, so that's always nice. Obviously, please follow our Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff. But if you really want to even communicate with me personally, then we have this Facebook group, which is called the Positive Audiophiles group, Plugin Alliance Audiophiles group. This is where you can get me.
Great. We'll definitely catch up with Dirk in that Facebook group. Thank you so much for joining us, Dirk, and sharing the story of this concept that have been so useful for you throughout the years. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.